I love it. I love it. We
Oh,
can go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining the virtual field trip of the 8th Annual Delaware River Watershed Forum. Just a couple housekeeping things before we dive in. The session will be recorded and posted on CDW's website early next week. That way, if any folks aren't here today, they can still participate and watch and get the information we all share. Everyone has the capability to let themselves off mute, so if you do have any questions, feel free. And then if you are having any technical issues, feel free to chat me in the box directly below. My name is Kelly Knutson. I'm the State Policy Manager with the Coalition. I'm happy to assist as much as I can. And then, of course, the rest of the forum schedule is posted on sketch.com. We do ask that attendees go in and select which sessions they're going to be on. That way we have a rough idea of participation for these sessions. And of course, it's more fruitful when we're all on video and can interact with each other. And of course, we wish we could do this all in person. So if you do feel comfortable, feel free to put on your video. Make sure you say your name and your organization, as well as your personal pronouns as well. But without further ado, I'll pass it over to Richard at Trout Unlimited. Thank you all.
thank you so much, Kelly. Let me just move this one screen. Okay. Hi, yeah, as Kelly said, my name is Rich Thomas, often also referred to as Mr. Sherry Rusty Thomas. I am a current Trout Unlimited National Board of Trustees member, although I did come up through the ranks in New Jersey Trout Unlimited, serving as a chapter president, NLC rep, and past council chair. And we're going over a fly tying 101, and I will preface right at the start that I am not a professional fly tyer. I do this for fun. I do it because I really enjoy catching fish on flies that I've tied. And why don't I turn it over to Ben for his introduction.
Greetings, everybody. Good morning, and thank you for joining us on this webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about insects. We're going to be talking about the Upper Delaware and how prolific the insects are on the Delaware and how they relate to our game, which is basically trying to catch these fish on flies. And Richie is going to be able to tie a couple of flies for us. But before we get started, just a little background on me. I've been guiding up here for the last probably 30 years plus. My wife and I currently run a bed and breakfast and an outfitting service called East Branch Outfitters. And pretty active in the FUDR community with helping out with science and consulting from time to time, and just generally supporting the group. It's an awesome organization, so we're happy to be a part of it. So without further ado, I guess we'll just go right into the slideshow that we got prepared for you. We've got a few slides that will talk about insect on the Delaware and basically what is on the menu. We have a very prolific system up here, and in the aquatic system there is lots of different food sources for trout. And the food sources is what we are trying to imitate when it comes to tying flies. So one of the most important questions that we ask ourselves when we approach the river is, what's on the menu? So if we can go to the next slide, Rich.
Yeah, Ben, I'm just going to reshare real quick. For some reason, this screen share is not advancing.
Okay. So while Richie does that, it looks like he might have it together. There's this menu item that we look at, and in the picture that you see currently on your screen, a nice little picture of a drift boat, and in the silhouette in front of you, you see there's a mayfly. But moving on to the next slide, one of the most important things that we have to be able to do is identify these insects so that we can imitate the insects that we have seen. So understanding the basic anatomy of an insect is a good place to start. So on this slide here, we're going to look at the insect anatomy, and this is a drawing of a stonefly, one of the many insects that are available in the aquatic ecosystem. And when we look at a stonefly or any insects, as it were, they're broken into three main sections. One is the head, which has the antenna and the mouth parts and the eyes, of course. And then you have a thorax region, and that thorax region is where the legs and the wings are located. And then you have the abdominal region, which is responsible for digestion and reproduction. So we can move on to the next slide there, Rich. The most important thing that we have to understand is that insects are available at times, and other times they are not, because they all go through a life cycle. And the life cycle, in this particular case, we're going to go counterclockwise on this particular slide. And we're going to notice whether it's the chicken or the egg, whichever one you want to start with. I'm going to start with the egg mass that's being laid by the adult. That egg mass will go down and it will hit the water, and it will disperse thousands of eggs, which then drift into the current and settle into the bottom, where that egg will hatch and turn into an embryo, the first stage of these insects' life cycle. Very small, little, microscopic almost in size, but basically a carbon copy of what is yet to come. And so that embryo develops over time, and these embryos and the insects and the larvae that are creepy and crawling around on the bottom of the river find their way in between little cracks in the rocks. They might burrow into the mud or the sand. You might have some insects that will actually set up a housekeeping in between rocks, depending on what insect it is. And they go through their life cycle and they grow in stages. And these stages are called instars. So these stages of insect growth are accompanied by a shedding of their skin, because insects have an exoskeleton. Their skin needs to be shed every time they move to the next stage. So over a course of several months, possibly even up to a year, some of these insects, and in other insects, there might be a 2-year or a 3-year actual life cycle that is aquatic, where the insect remains in the water and goes through these growth stages while it eats and basically recycles the materials that are in the bottom of the river and turn them into nutrients that are available for the fish to eat. And that whole nutrient cycle is replenished, because these bugs are in the river taking care of basically processing this dead, dying, material at the bottom of the river. So as they grow, they reach a final stage in their life cycle where their aquatic stage is pretty much over, and they have to then transform into a terrestrial stage where they'll crawl out of the water, they'll emerge from the water, and they will transform and grow wings and be able to move around and then mate outside of the aquatic environment. So we have this emergence in this one slide here. You have a metamorphosis or emergence. You see the insect is actually crawling out of its nymphal shuck, and it becomes an adult. And in most cases, the adult is a viable insect. It's ready for reproduction. It can eat and drink and have a good time and be around for a little while, but eventually that adult will have to mate with other adults. And then once that mating is done, then you end up with a fertilized female who then drops her eggs, and the life cycle begins all over again. So we can move on to the next slide, Rich. In the Delaware system, we have a lot of different kinds of insects that live in the aquatic environment. And for our purposes as fly anglers, and just for this very short 101 discussion, I've broken it down into 3 main constituents, 3 chapters, if you will, of insects. The first chapter being a caddisfly, and the caddisfly is located in the upper left of your screen. And its life cycle is very much like a butterfly or a moth, in that it has a very complete life cycle. And once it emerges from the water, it's a very active insect and can be noticed in the river, along the sides of the banks of the river, flying around. It kind of resembles a moth when it flies around. So in this particular insect's life cycle, it's very much like a butterfly or a moth in that it is a worm-like larva. It has the ability to spin silk, just like all other insects of this category. And they can then build little cases that they roam around on the bottom of the river. They might end up building some type of net structure that they live in between the rocks that filters the food, and they can go out and graze on them. And then they go through a period of metamorphosis where they actually lock themselves up into a little protective case that may be made out of stones, or it might be made out of sticks, and they'll go through a metamorphosis and then emerge. And then when they emerge, they're emerging as an adult, you know, ready to go out and spend some time out of the water and flying around and mating. So, and then the next slide we'll look at, not a next slide, but I'm sorry, Rich, you go back to that other slide. The other one on the bottom left-hand corner is a stonefly. And in the earlier slide that we had with the anatomy, this is the adult version of that stonefly. So you'll see it kind of looks like almost like a roach kind of looking thing, and it's got two equal pairs of wings that lay flat across the back. And this insect is very active. Usually it will hatch at night. It'll emerge from the water and crawl up onto some substrate, whether it be grass or a stone or a log, and it will go through this emergence and turn into the adult stonefly. Again, this insect will be active and be able to fly around and be available as trout food. And then on our far right of this particular slide, we have a mayfly. And you can see that the mayfly has a different kind of wing structure than the caddisfly or the stonefly. And the mayfly's wing is an upright, almost like a sailboat. And it has two wings. One is big and one is small. Some of them will have two tails. Some of them will have three tails. And basically, these insects will emerge from the bottom of the river in what we call a hatch. And that hatch is what may get the fish turned on so that we can actually target them with particular fly patterns that we have in our box that imitate what these insects look like. So next slide, Rich. We'll go over a brief, very brief discussion about caddisflies and what we can notice about caddisflies. They have a complete life cycle, just like a butterfly or a moth, as I mentioned before. They're case builders. They will actually build a little case. They might build a net, or they might be free ranging. In other words, they can walk around on the substrate on the bottom. The adult's wings are tent-like when they're at rest. So if you happen to see a caddisfly sitting on your windowsill or your windscreen, or possibly along the bank of the river, you'll notice that the caddisfly, when it's not flying around, the wings resemble a pup tent. The pupa of these insects is a moth-like insect. So as an adult, these pupa have to go through this emergent. And in the bottom of center of this particular slide, you can see that there's a developing pupa that has just emerged from a case. So in the meantime, this is a very active swimming insect. But at this point in time, it becomes vulnerable and available for trout food. You can see on the tip of my finger there a picture of that caddisfly and what it might look like at rest. So these insects come in various sizes and various shapes. The profiles are basically the same, but their basic characteristics are what determine them to be a mayfly, a stonefly, or a caddisfly. Okay, next slide, Richie, please. All right, so here we're talking about a stonefly. And a stonefly has a life cycle that is simple. It doesn't have a metamorphosis stage. It actually goes from its aquatic stage after its transitional growths through those different instars to the adult pre-hatch stage. And then once it hatches into an adult insect. There is no metamorphosis to speak of. So these nymphs are very active. You can see on the far left of this screen, if you blow it up a little bit, how many of these insects have crawled out onto that log and have emerged. and left their exoskeletons behind. In the center of this screen at the bottom, you'll notice that this is a representative of a stonefly nymph. And a stonefly nymph has a head and antenna, legs, and the little plates across its back are where those wings will eventually emerge when that insect finally reaches its adult stage. Stoneflies have two tails, only two tails. Mayflies have two tails, or they may have three tails. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see an adult stonefly where you see the equal-sized wings. And when this insect flies around, it resembles kind of an X-wing fighter from Star Wars, or it's kind of got a boxy shape. So we can notice what this insect is from afar without actually having to catch it. Just like a caddisfly kind of looks like a moth when it's flying around, we know that that's a caddisfly. Next slide, please, Rich. Okay, so now we get into the fun ones. I really like mayflies, and mayflies are like the bread and butter of the aquatic insects that are available on this river. We have very, very many different kinds of mayflies, as well as caddisflies and stoneflies. But the mayflies are the ones that are most intriguing to us all, because they go through different stages of development and different profiles that the trout will key in on when it's time to feed. And they can sense when a hatch is about ready to begin, because all of these thousands and thousands of little nymphs, which you see on the lower left-hand corner of this slide, these nymphs will become very active, and eventually they will emerge. And once they emerge, the first part of their emergence has to go from the bottom to the top. So they have to come from the bottom of the river and get their way up to the surface of the river. And they become very vulnerable to trout, for trout to feed on. But as they're moving through the water column, their shape is changing, because they may be in different stages of emergence. So in this particular slide, in the middle, down on the bottom, we have what we refer to as the done stage of the insect. And this is a stage of the insect that's kind of prepubescent, if you will. It's not available, it's not mature enough to actually reproduce at this point. And it has to go through one more stage of development where it sheds its skin one more time and becomes the adult reproductive stage, which we call the spinner. So if I'm just going to read through this. The life cycle is simple with a twist. It's much like the stonefly, goes from an egg through a nymph, through this emergence into an upright winged, what we call a dun, and then it molts into the spinner. And in this particular group of insects, we have lots of different occupations of territory in the river. We have clingers that will actually cling to the rocks. And then we have crawlers that'll crawl around on the rocks. Their profile is a little bit different. Then we have swimmers that don't have any kind of home base, so to speak, and they swim around and feed where they need to feed. And then we have burrowers, and burrowers, as the name implies, they burrow down into the sediment and they go through their life cycle down underneath. The bottom right-hand picture of this slide, you'll see an adult spinner and the shed exoskeleton of that spinner that once was a dun and now has turned into a spinner. Next slide, please, Rich.
Hey, Ben, we're about 20 minutes in. Why don't I take a pause here and tie up a fly or two, and then we can come back to the presentation.
Yeah, we don't even need to. We've got the basics taken care of. I didn't know it was taking that long.
That's all.
All right,
it's all good.
Back to you, Rich.
Perfect. All right, let me do this. I'm going to switch cameras here. And here comes the real test. Like first time tying in front of an actual live audience, so we'll see where this goes. As Ben mentioned, the first stage that we talk about of the, I'll be tying mayflies, and specifically the Isonychia. It's a bigger mayfly, certainly a lot easier to tie. And we're going to start off with the nymph stage. In particular, for this case, it's going to be a beadhead nymph. You can see my hook in the vise straw. I've already attached a bead on here. And as mentioned, when the mayfly releases itself from the bottom of the river, it kind of floats up through the water column and works, as Ben said, swims, crawls, or floats its way to the top, at which point it rides the surface of the water, and that's where the wing hatch starts. So we're imitating the mayfly or the nymph working its way through the water at this time. First, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start out and put on a twist of non-lead wire. And what this is going to do is weight the fly down and get it down toward the bottom, because when trout are not feeding on we're not feeding on surface flies, they're down toward the bottom and they're picking these nymphs off one after another as they're riding up through the surface. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to put on a layer of thread. This is going to start the base of the fly. I'll get it to a point, and I'm going to cut off my tag end. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a tail. And to do that, I'm using a pheasant tail feather where I've pulled off. Again, there's many different forms of materials you could use for the tail, for the body, for the wing. A lot of time it actually comes during this, my selection process is, what I'm tying at the time and, what materials I have in front of me. I've often heard you could take all your scraps, tie them to a hook, and if your presentation is right, you'll catch a fish. Anyway, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to tie this tail about a hook length back from the base of where I left off at, and I use what's called a pinch technique, where I pinch down the line or the thread. I'm going to work my way back, and I now have a tail section that is locked in. For this particular fly, I'm going to utilize the remaining material. I'm going to work it forward, and this is also going to become my wing case. Next thing that I want to do is I want to add a body. And to do that, I'm going to bring my thread back to the midsection. I'm going to put on a little dubbing wax. It's not always required. I find it easier for getting your dubbing or the body material to adhere to the hook. This particular case, I'm going to be utilizing a brownish body, which the Isonychia tends to have in color during most phases of its life cycle. And the key with dubbing is to apply it thin so it doesn't bunch up. If you have to do it in several different phases, that's okay. Again, what I'm doing here is I'm creating what they call a dubbing noodle. Kind of looks like a spaghetti noodle. A little bit thick there.
And if I can add into this while you're spinning that dubbing on there, dubbing can be made from a lot of different materials. The most common material for dubbing is rabbit fur that has been either dyed or in natural colors. Rabbit fur has characteristics that allow it to be soft and supple, and you can actually spin the fibers of the rabbit fur around the thread, and that bulking up of the thread is what Richie has done right now to add some body material and body bulk to the fly. Go ahead, Rich.
Thanks, Ben. So what I've done is I've got a tapered body that I've created. And in lieu of time, I've avoided a step here, and that is you can put in wire to create the abdomen sections, and basically it would wrap around and create segments on there. But again, not always required. Trout are gonna feed on this, and really no matter what it looks like, as long as it's got a nice flow through the water column. For the thorax area, I'm going to use peacock herl. And what I've done is I just basically cut the tips off there just to give it an even structure where I can place it on the fly. Plus two, the tips can tend to be very brittle. So I'm just going to wrap this around a couple times, lock my material in, and then I'm just going to cut off this little tag end here. You could use hackle pliers, or what I'll just use, my fingers just to wrap this around and create a nice, thick thorax area. Another thing to remember, and what I've found too, is, as I mentioned earlier, presentation, in my opinion, is 90% of targeting trout. Specifically when dry fly fishing, we'll talk about that on the next fly, but 90% presentation, probably 6 or 7% fly size, and that is what they're feeding on the time, and then the remaining percentage comes down to color. But I also find too is the more you have sparse material, loose material hanging out, makes the fly look buggier, and I often find that that's what trout kind of target and look for. So right now I'm gonna just use this remaining material and tie what's called the wing case, and I'm just going to put a light wrap over the top right behind my bead. Put a couple wraps on that. There's a finer scissor here to cut this off. And then usually what I'll do is I'll just grab a little bit more dubbing, tiny bit, just to cover up that last remaining tag of the thorax. And I finish the fly with a whip finish. And 1, 2, 3 turns, usually sufficient. And again, if I was, had more time, I'd put a little dab of glue on here just to lock everything in place. Another thing people are doing these days is they're using, it's a gel or a resin epoxy that gets put on over the wing case itself. And that sometimes will, creates a shinier surface on the top, but it also really locks in your materials. So this here is, a basics Isonychia nymph.
Can you pop that out and show it a little bit closer to the camera for us, Rich?
I will certainly try, but as I said, I don't know if it's going to focus in on that. Let me pull back. I don't know where it's going to give it best focus.
So if you can lay it in the palm of your hand, maybe we can see that contrast. You can see that insect that kind of resembles that nymph stage that we were looking at earlier on earlier slides. Very nice, Rich.
Okay. For my next fly, I'm actually going to imitate a dun. And this is a fly pattern that I had learned years ago as a member of Central Jersey Trout Unlimited. And again, this pattern is it's a little different in the fact that all of its features are overemphasized. It's something that, again, the bigger profile, the bigger wing, the longer tail, I often find, the trout really hone in on. And this particular fly was named after a gentleman by the name of Edmer Quat. And the actual fly itself is called Edmer Quat's brown thing, or EMBT. So for this fly, I'm going to be using a tan 8/0 thread. And again, I'm going to start just like I did last time, laying down a nice base of thread. just about to where the hook tip is. And then I'm going to use a feather called Coq de Leon, which again is another type of bird feather. And I'm going to gather my tips. If I had more time, I'd probably put these through a feather stacker just to make sure that they're more even, but I was able to pull off enough that's, you know, or for the most part have a nice even taper slash, and they all line up at the back end. I'm just going to tie that in. As you can see, this tail is a little bit further extenuated than I would, you know, tie on other smaller type mayflies where I really want to get down my my size. For the wing, I'm going to be using a polypropylene floating yarn. And for this, I'm going to take about a hook's length, slightly bigger. I could always trim it off afterwards. And I'm going to tie this into the front, trying to keep even. I'm going to apply pressure on my upstroke, pulling it up on each one, just giving it a little bit more pressure. Make sure that's locked in there. Shorten this up. And then I'm going to take a few turns, getting tighter each time that I go toward the back. When I'm back after securing that in, I'm going to cut that off. I cut it at an angle. What that does is that's going to create an additional taper at the back end of the thorax region. And when I, again, tie my dubbing on, it's going to taper evenly. Bring the thread forward. In this case, I'm going to take a bunch of turns toward the front, and what this is going to do is build up that wing. And this one, I'm actually a little bit further back behind the eye than I would have liked to be, but again, I'm going to blame it on pressure of an audience. In this case, now what I'm going to do is post the wing, and this is where I'm going to actually tie my hackle. The hackle serves actually a couple different purposes. The main purpose is it's going to keep the fly on top of the water, keeping that floating nature, so to speak. And I'm just going to build this up here.
Now, the hackle that Rich is talking about is actually, it's a feather from chickens. And the feather from the chicken can be, if you take a feather and kind of bend it a little bit, it breaks down into smaller fibers. And it's those fibers on the quill of the feather that create the spikiness of the hackle, which allows the fly to sit high in the water and keeps it afloat.
Also, too, is you know, the way on this particular tie, this is called a parachute tie. The fact that we're almost going to look like a parachute when it's done, the way we actually wrap the hackle feather on, as opposed to a traditional catskill tie, which the feather's tied this way as opposed to this way, or around you know, the horizontal plane. Again, I'm going to tie on some dubbing. I'm going to create the body. This will also help the fly float. We apply, you know, external, we call it chemicals, floating material, we'll call it, that has been created, which helps the fly itself float on top of the water. That's, as anglers, we're, you know, constantly, you know, want to keep that fly dry. And I'm just going to put a little bit more on here. Spread that out. I bring my thread, as you can, it's to your front, but to my backside of the fly here. And what I've done is I've prepared some of those hackle feathers that you know, Ben was talking about. This is half of one here. Really good tires. They don't need to trim off one side. They tend to fold it as they go. They get more feather, more properties out of the feather itself, as far as you know, keeping it on the fly. And actually, I'm going to take one right back because I forgot. I do need to lock this in place. I do lock it toward the front of the fly. Give it another wrap just to secure it. Trim off that tag end. And then I'm going to bring the feather to the back and put another wrap in here. And then I'm going to grab this is actually a parachute hackle plier. What this does is this holds the feather for you, but this one's on a swivel as opposed to a standard hackle plier. For wrapping, does not have that swivel on it. And what this allows you to do is I wrap this toward the top of the fly, and I just slowly wrap that around the post that we started earlier. And as I said, that the more material on here, the better it's going to help this fly float on top of the water. Now, as I get toward the end of where those the actual feather parts or the barbs are themselves, the individual segments on the feather, I'm just going to lock in around the stem that is left. Get a couple good turns on that, trying not to grab the feathers on top, but again, as I said, just locking that in is key, because then I'm going to snip off that little tag end, get a couple further wraps on there, and then what I'll do is at this time I want to build up toward the front of the fly. This, as I mentioned earlier, probably could have been a little bit closer there. But to do this, I'm just going to delicately grab all of the feathers, pull them back, and then build up a nice head at the top. And what this is going to do is put that final lock in of all your feathers, secure that. And same thing as we did with our other fly, is we're going to put a whip finish on this, and this, I just kind of get in there. Okay. Let me start that over. Try not to grab as many of those as I can. 3. Now, I'm closing on this fly. I'll spin it around and just see if there's any feathers that are truly way out of place. But as I mentioned earlier, I mean, I could clean this up, and but what this kind of represents here, I did grab a couple small little barbs from the feather that could act as antenna. These other barbs that are sticking out of the bottom can actually simulate legs. So again, I don't get too crazy on the actual fly looking 100% perfect. And if you're a fish looking up from underneath the water, this is basically the profile that you're going to see if you're directly under the fly. Now, fish tend to be off to the side a little bit. They're what they call Snell window, or their angle from what they're seeing is they actually rise up at an angle. There's basically a 6-inch window that they're looking at for these flies floating down on top of the surface. They go up, they pick them off, then they drop back down into what they call their feeding lies. So they're going to be slightly off center a little bit. And this is what they're seeing. They're seeing, A, the profile of the wing, because that'll be sticking out of the water. And then some of these smaller barbs on the bottom. And here's another one, of course, not under pressure, looks a little different, tied. And you could see the profile on that. I'm gonna put it back in my hand like Ben had showed earlier. This one a little bit further up toward the eye of the hook. And same thing, a little bit taller on the wing, but like I said, if I found that to be too high, simple solution, just give it a little trim, tape. A lot of times what I'll do is I'll taper them back a little bit. So again, resembles the actual mayfly like you saw in the previous pictures. And I would have liked to have gotten to 2 more flies, but I think we're just about out of time here. I think we have a few minutes left. I could open it up to any questions if there are any. If not, let me also, indicate that, trout, trout are the proverbial canary in the coal mine when it comes to healthy water systems. It's a fish that relies on cold, clean water. If you don't have trout, there's probably something wrong with your ecosystem. And it's through the partnerships of Trout Unlimited, Friends of the Upper Delaware River, and some of these other organizations that are just striving to ensure that these systems are clean. It's these organizations that are continual, acquiring grants, et cetera, and the folks that are on the ground actually performing the work that are sustaining our systems for future generations. So, any questions?
Rich, there is a question from Jeff in the chat box. Is there a direct connection between clean water and the abundance of mayfly, stonefly, caddis populations?
Oh yeah, it's up to 100%. As a matter of fact, it's not always the trout. Like trout are there. Trout can only be there if they have an abundant food source. One of the things. Oh, let me see. Let me click over. And one of the things that we've noticed over the so many years, especially dealing with the FFMP, is the FFMP is very strict on what they're releasing at any given time. And, one of the things we really strive for is that plan is the quote unquote flexible as part of the flexible flow management program. And we've seen over past years that when they change from one flow regime to another, that in certain cases they've dewatered the parts of the system, parts of the river. And this doesn't really impact trout. Trout will find cold water for the most part. It stresses them, but they know how to find cold water. They've done it, over the course of, thousands of years. But when you dewater the system up here, you're exposing the bottom of the river. And what do you think is happening to those insects in their nymph stage and their larva stage when the sun is beating directly on them with no water to protect them? It's killing them off. You're killing off a food source, and therefore you're potentially hurting future generations of trout. Hopefully that answered your question, Jeff. Your baited question, I'm sure, if you know that.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Rich.
Any other questions, comments? Okay. Well, again, Kelly, I think we're going to 9:45, correct?
Yes. You have like 1 or 2 minutes if you want to address anything else, say some closing remarks and such.
Okay. Yeah, no, again, I just want to, thank everybody. I'm a volunteer for Trout Unlimited. I'm also a project manager with AT&T with about 32 years, and hoping that a life after AT&T will get me more involved with doing stuff on the water up here, especially in the Upper Delaware system. I think I see a question that did come in. Let me see here. Let me open that up. Are there any materials people should avoid that damage ecosystems? So from a fly tying perspective, not really. I mean, those that are making materials are, pretty much, most of it, well, traditionally was natural. There are a lot of synthetic materials these days. Case in point, here's one. This is what's called trigger point fibers that we use for tying bodies and wings, etc. It's a synthetic. So, but bottom line, there's nothing there that really can come off that as far as being a poison or something like that that would interfere with the river system. Really, what you want to watch out though for entering or exiting water systems is you should always try to dry your material, your boots off, your waders off as best as possible. If you're entering from one watershed to another, there are certain diseases. Furunculosis was one. Didymo, rock snot, as they call it, was another, which seems to come and go. And one of the things we try to avoid as anglers is having that material on our boots or our waders going from one water system to another to avoid spreading there. Hopefully that answered that question. Anything else? Let me see here. Crying baby, no problem. Don't see any other questions. So again, thank you, everybody. Hopefully it was somewhat informative. As always, feel free to reach out to Ben or myself if there are any other questions, and look forward to seeing you on the river someday.
Thank you so much, Richard and Ben. And thank you all for joining today.
Thank you. See you on the river.
Thank you for being here. Appreciate your time.
Thank you. Nice job.
Thank you.
Thank you.